Efendim şu kadarını söyleyeyim kıymetli katılımcılar. Sektörünüz zor, işiniz ağır ve bizim gibi insanların hakikaten sizin dünyanızda yeri yok, söyleyeyim. Ya mevzuları anlamak zaten zor da başlıkları geçmek bile başlı başına bir hamle. Bir iş ya. Bak şimdi sıradaki sunumumuz DevSecOps'ta kimliğe dayalı güvenlik yaklaşımı. Hangi kimlik? Makbul mu? Düşünsel mi? Hangi kimliğe dayanıyoruz? Ne oluyor? İnsan insanlığından çıkıyor. Yıldım ya. Ama siz mevzuyu biliyorsunuz eminim. Hakimsiniz. Zaten mevzunun da üstadı konuşacak. Dolayısıyla kimliğe dayalı güvenlik yaklaşımını pırıl pırıl zihnimiz alacak, kabul edecek. Sevgili Erdi Aktan, Innovera'dan bu mevzuyu Alan Redford'la konuşacak. Alan Redford da Quest'ten biliyorsunuz. Hadi dinleyelim.
Hi everyone. Today we have Quest One Identities Regional Chief Technology Officer Alan Redford here. Hi Alan, how is everything?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And Alan here is to describe us One Identity's role for the identity governance and also the other features he will now present. And first of all, Alan, can you please describe briefly One Identity's added value to the security area? Which fields One Identity, which gaps One Identity fills?
So One Identity is a holistic identity access management vendor that look at governance from the top down and also from the bottom up when it comes to privilege management and Active Directory centric security. We take a zero trust approach, or a continuous zero trust approach to the new perimeter, which is identity, and in our opinion, has always been the perimeter in many ways. So we are a governance, identity access management, privilege access management vendor, taking that holistic approach and helping our customers lead in governance strategies.
Thank you. So, you know, our topics, this conference topic is DevSecOps, how we can implement this and what are all the holistic technologies which support this DevSecOps environment. So, how can you introduce security to DevOps strategy without slowing things down? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because DevOps is an exercise in agility and doing things faster in more continuous fashion. The developers producing code and builds while operations side is continuously monitoring and maintaining. I think it's important to realize that when you're introducing security to an agility exercise, there is very much a balancing act where, on the one hand, being more agile means making more money, but in so doing adopting risk. Tempering that with security means that there is a need to spend money on security, but by the same token, remaining agile in an effective way. So for that reason, I think it's a good question. And when you introduce things like governance, things like management of privileges into a DevOps exercise, that DevOps strategy really needs to take a look at ownership, and it needs to take a look at the privileges that are being used, or the accounts and authentications that are being used, not just in the code, but also the certificates themselves and the build cycles that go through the pipelines. So introducing technology to that has to be done in as frictionless a way as possible. Where we've worked with customers in those exercises, we take a very frictionless approach, and in so doing, we allow developers to use whatever tools they need to use to get the job done, rather than enforcing change. It's very easy for an organization, too easy, in my opinion, for an organization to say you can't use that tool anymore, you have to use this tool. doing so can be very inhibitive. Having been a developer myself in the past, being free to use the tools you need to do in order to do the job effectively is a very important piece of the puzzle. And so for any process and technology that you introduce to those people, it has to be done so in a way that facilitates that agility on an ongoing basis. And that is something that One Identity does for our customers.
Great. Thank you for this nice answer. So think about, for example, I have a security team. I'm a customer. I have a security team. And why should I bother my development team or my operations team about security conceptions? What do you think?
Well, I think the operations team would be people who would bother the security team, and I think the developers would like to fly under the radar as much as possible. When it comes to the build cycles out of DevOps, there's a lot of work going on that goes through continuous testing, user acceptance testing, and so on before it even gets into production. And mistakes can be made. There are two trains of thought. There's one where mistakes can be made, and there's the other where they're not necessarily mistakes, disgruntled employees and so on. When going through these build cycles, you've also got the process from switching from continuous delivery or the user acceptance testing phase further on into deployment. And it's often a good practice for the deployment exercise to not actually be autonomous, for it to be manual in some situations, especially with the larger, more heavyweight software deployments. So in terms of the question, it is very, very important to understand that developers are trying to do things quickly, okay? And operations are trying to facilitate that as much as possible and strike a balance. It's not a security-focused discipline. The objective of DevOps is agility. The objective of DevOps is not security. So the security team should be very deeply involved with what DevOps and what your developers and operations are doing, but in a frictionless way. Back to the other question. And when you go down that path and you start looking at, from a security objective, what the developers are actually doing, there are, in many cases, containers being spun up and down, created and destroyed, doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And while that might be okay in a test bed, there are knock-on effects. I'll give you an example. Several customers that I've engaged with in the past, particularly in high-level enterprise, I say high-level, large enterprise, sort of 500,000 users plus, their environments are too large to actually have an effective test environment, okay? And when you have those scenarios, it's quite often that the data coming from production is read-only. And when you have that scenario, you can very easily fall into the trap of having privileged data sitting in a test bed environment where, although it's still a test environment and the impact on production may be minimized as a result, the data itself is very real, okay? Because security is not just about what people can do, it's also about what people can see, what people can access, okay? And then what they do with the information. Data plus structure is information. So the challenge of DevOps security is to make sure that the data is being handled correctly, okay? And then when being pushed back out into production, the code itself is built in a secure fashion using secure practices, but also critically that the accounts being used have the correct access models wrapped around them, that the correct compliance is adhered to, and most importantly, that the business can see and understand what's being done with which accounts, when, and how, which is where governance comes in. It's also very easy for, in smaller environments in particular, for accounts to become orphaned through the DevOps process. And keys and certificates we see getting left by the wayside all the time. So ownership, orphaning of accounts, governance pieces that go with that, it all ties back into having deep relationships with security, DevOps, and well, the devs and the operations team working combined with security. Just because you have a security team doesn't necessarily mean that the gap is closed.
Yep, great. I totally agree with you. So, you know, like in DevOps, developers and operators need to have a frictionless communication. In DevSecOps, I think the security team also need to be joined this frictionless community and have a nice communication with them. So there is another question actually. You know, speed and agility is very important in continuous integration and delivery and deployment pipelines. So what tools should I use to monitor these pipelines? Hello.
So I think the tools that you use should rely on open standards. And the reason I say that is because integration is a big piece of DevOps. And when you look at those deployment pipelines and the tools that are being used, privileged access management has a place there in terms of the management of credentials and the management of the certificates and keys that are being used. High ephemeral rate is a phrase that's often thrown around when looking at the rates of authentications required there when you're spinning up loads of containers, okay? And ultimately, there's a lot of tools in the whole DevOps process. There's a lot of them, okay? When you go through that pipeline, those tools need to be secured from a baseline. Now, if you're using open standards, that can be easily achieved with the right PAM tools and right governance approach. If you're being forced down the road of using specific tools throughout that process, then you can very quickly find yourself needing to use specific standards where APIs become restrictive. So it becomes a case in point where when you're using a PAM tool in that environment, it's very important for it to be able to use open standards, for it to be flexible enough to not force you down a rabbit hole. And you know, if you pardon the plug, One Identity is one such vendor where when we introduce security to a DevOps process, we don't say, hey, you can't use your existing tool, you have to use our tool. We are there to fit the mold. It's our job to follow the business value, wherever that may lead. And everybody's business is different. So as a vendor, we can't really afford to force you down the road of using a specific tool. That's why our technology is built to use open standards.
So Ellen, can you please briefly describe the One Identity's solution family? I know that you have some privileged access manager and identity governance tools. Can you please summarize all of it?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. Before I do though, I just want to outline a few facts that our approach is based on and our strategy as a vendor is based on. Because Gartner released a survey 2 years ago now, which really stood out to me. They surveyed their customers around DevSecOps. The question was, where is your organization with DevSecOps? And I'd encourage you to think about what your answer is. There were 4 principal responses. Some people said that they haven't asked security to be involved because they typically just slow things down in DevOps, okay? It was 11% respondents. Security just slows DevOps down, so we haven't asked security to be involved at all. 11% said that. 48%, the majority, said they haven't asked security to be involved, but haven't yet integrated security into DevOps at all. Okay, 48%. 41%, the remainder, said that security is in the early stages of integrating DevOps initiatives. Now, there was a 4th response available. Security is well integrated into DevOps, delivering DevSecOps. 0%, 0 responded with that. There's a multiple choice answer. And that really stood out to me and highlights the importance of raising awareness in the DevOps world of the need for security. Too easily, it falls into a privileged access management conversation. Now, privileged access management and DevOps are two different things, okay, but they're complementary to each other. DevOps, PAM, they have some key differences around scope, requested processes, durations, target audience. When we look at PAM, we're talking about privileged accounts. We're talking about humans using those accounts and robots as well. So RPA is a big thing. Those accounts tend to be changed not as quickly as the DevOps needs to be changed. That is to say that there's a higher rate of usage credentials, higher ephemeral rates in DevOps. Okay. Fundamentally though, PAM has been seen as something that's a tool for admins, whereas DevOps is a strategy for developers. They have different strengths and weaknesses. DevOps is around speed and integration. PAM is around security and compliance. Okay. Around that automation of DevOps comes automated access, the need to move quickly. And fundamentally, it's agility in DevOps versus security and privileged access management, finding the right balance. When we move to be agile, when we strive for agility, we're striving to do more with less, and being agile as a result, fundamentally making more money, but inheriting risk as we do so. Whereas privileged access management is an exercise with DevOps balancing that risk and marrying that agility with security so that we can have our cake and eat it, so that we can run fast and run firm. So when we think about DevOps in that context, and we think about, you know, things like self-healing deployments, the need to codify testing, having that release criteria, reducing human error, you know, getting more features out more often. I can't stress enough, DevOps is not targeted at security. Okay, so the layer facilitate there is needed. And that's how we designed our PAM solution. Our PAM solution was designed by developers for developers, relies on open standards as a result. And being the only hardened black box appliance that's routinely pen tested, we have a lot of customers who buy it on that premise alone, using, you know, managing root accounts and long-running VMs, you know, privileged accounts with key workloads against databases, core cloud services and directories, or indeed needing to record access to critical environments, production networks, is just scratching the surface. When you then consider how we've got tools out there like HashiCorp, for example, there are DevOps vaults that are there to facilitate agility but don't have a security first model. And those are the areas where it's important to add value. And that's what we do as a vendor. Also from the governance perspective, ownership. You know, how many times you've walked around your organization's digital infrastructure. Very easy to walk around and ask the question, what is this? Who owns it? Nobody knows. Whether it's an employee, whether it's a virtual employee, whether it's data, whether it's an application, whether it's an asset. And that all needs to be brought under one holistic governance strategy. And that's really the end goal of a lot of these initiatives. So DevOps is a strong focus for our privileged access management solutions. Active Directory is a very strong focus for everybody in security. And you know, we're certainly not alone in that. But what we do very well is zero trust, continuous zero trust when it comes to just-in-time provisioning, just-in-time privilege elevation, wrapping around a real firewall around Active Directory so that we can leverage real zero trust security when we look at DevOps, governance, PAM, and beyond. The governance piece is very, very important, not just to understand the ownership, but to continually attest, reattest, reassess. None of this is a process that we just complete walk away from. It's all an ongoing process. It's all continuous. This is not project by project stuff. This is ongoing investment. This is ongoing monitoring. This is ongoing process. It all has to be continuous. And then finally, an area that's up and coming, has been for probably 2 or 3 years now, is around the treating of a robot or a digital worker as a true virtual identity that also needs managing privileges, that also needs governance, that also needs ownership, that also needs separation of duties and everything that goes with it. If I have accounts payable and my colleague has accounts receivable, that's fine. That's how normal identity access management should work. But if I've got a robot that has accounts payable and a robot that has accounts receivable, who owns the robots? If I own both the robots, there's a problem. If there's one robot orchestrating those two robots, there's a problem. And it's often, too often, an unconsidered need. And I wonder how many of you out there are nodding your heads right now and considering the impact of this. And that's why we've partnered with 3 Gartner leaders in that market, Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere, and UiPath, to bring governance, to bring privileged access management to those agile RPA initiatives. So in a nutshell, that's one identity.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for this really nice, valuable, and brief explanation for the one identity's added value to DevSecOps. And I hope you enjoyed. And that's we cut right